so much. There's nowhere I'd rather be on my birthday than in this room with so many friends and colleagues and former students, and what a great chance to celebrate all the work of the center. Although, Florian, I'm a 2008 graduate, just to be clear. You know I'm wise, but don't age me. No, I'm just kidding. So it's a real pleasure today to introduce our first set of panelists, who maybe I'll ask the panelists to come and join me on the stage. Yes, well, when I introduce you. So our first panelist is Dr. Katie Zalagi, Assistant Professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Manitoba. Dr. Alex Maguiros, Assistant Professor at the Lincoln Alexander School of Law at Toronto Metropolitan University. Dr. Greg Hagan, Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary. Dr. Alana Morishat, Professor of Cybersecurity and Behavior at Western Sydney University. Professor Susie Dunn, Assistant Professor at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University. And finally, Dr. Kristen Thomason, Associate Professor and Senior Chair in Law, Robotics and Society at Windsor Law School, Windsor University. So thanks to all the panelists for joining us, and we're looking forward to a great discussion.
Good morning. How's everybody doing? Yeah, feeling good? Happy birthday, Jenna. What a delight. There's nowhere I'd rather be on a Friday morning than with all of you, and it is a distinct pleasure to be here this morning celebrating the incredible achievements of this center. And when this panel got together for the first time on Zoom to chat, it was immediately clear that we were going to monopolize the entire day with all of our stories and anecdotes and fond memories of the time that we shared together or separately in this program. And so I think that to begin, there's no better way than to share some of those stories. How did we come to the study of law and technology? When we were members of the center here, what was something that was happening? What's a charming anecdote? What do we remember from the time that we spent as students studying? And Alana, maybe we'll begin with you.
So I was the inaugural year of the Law and Tech program. Greg was there as well, and it was an interesting time because most lawyers knew nothing about technology, and by virtue of the fact that I'd done 1 year of computer science, I learned how to do Cobalt and Fortran before I realized I was the only woman in the program, and I switched to something else. You know, we've come a long way since then. But it was a time when there was a lot of opportunities, so I feel like I was very lucky. So I got to do a lot of different things with my professors, Michael, Ian, the lady in Kerr, and Danielle. And I think for me, it's really emboldened my vision to give opportunities to students that are in front of you that you wouldn't normally, and you might monopolize yourself. So I got to go to Geneva in place of Michael. I got to go to Montreal in place of Michael. I got to go to Tokyo in place of Danielle. Ian didn't send me anywhere, that guy. But it was like a really good experience, and it gave me a lot of confidence at that time to just go and explore and take any opportunity that came my way. So that's probably the most memorable thing for me, and I try to do the same thing now with my own students.
Greg, you were there at the same time. Did you have similar experiences, different experiences? No, we need Greg, guys.
Sorry, I think, yeah, that's on now. Yeah, it was a great opportunity early on. Like Alana said, I was in the inaugural class. I can remember the great discussions we had in Ian Kerr's technoprudence class. I also had a class in internet law with Daniel Gervais, which was an amazing class dealing with copyright law and the internet. I took a course from Michael Geist on electronic commerce, have fond memories of that. I think some of my fondest memories are both the class discussions, which were very rich, and also the discussions which poured over outside of class with people like Alana and other members of the classes. I can remember extensive discussions with a friend of mine, Kim Von Arx at the time, on, back then, some of the topics we were interested in included the domain name infrastructure, very technical. They used to think of that as internet governance, kind of a narrow view of internet governance. We found a restaurant that had we thought, a loss leader appetizer. And we spent a lot of money on this loss leader appetizer at this restaurant talking about internet governance. And we ended up writing a couple papers on the idea of repatriating or patriating the .ca domain name back to Canada. So it was a time, an early time for discussions of internet policy. And I think a lot of the issues which were touched on in a number of the classes that I took have only become more important. Involving all of society and growing and developing. So that's a little bit to start with.
Thank you. And thank you, Greg, for being our token man on this panel. It is good when you have a panel to have a token man. So we see, I think, from Alana and Greg's comments, how the center was beginning, right? Some of these ideas, this table is maybe not stable. It's a bit dangerous. All right. How the center was beginning and what kind of ideas were percolating easy on. There were opportunities to travel internationally. There were opportunities to lead the discourse on ideas that were just emerging this time. And a number of years later, Kristen and I started our studies in 2009. So perhaps, Kristen, you can chronologically go next.
Yeah, thank you. Well, when we were talking in our group, we were thinking about, sort of reflect back on what was going on at the time when you were in law school. I had the wonderful privilege, and I know others are the same, of doing both my JD and my PhD at U Ottawa. So there are about a billion anecdotes that I could easily draw from. But the one that came immediately to mind was Professor Ian Kerr, who I know was a mentor and friend to so many of us in the room, initiated a reading group for a group of 6 JD students who were just basically ultra nerds. And 4 of us are in this room today, which I think, and the other 2 we're still in touch with and are maybe not working specifically in tech law, but we called ourselves the Super Six Pack. So I think back to that reading group, and the topic that I focused my research on in that group was this proposal at the time that seemed so hypothetical to introduce AI and robotics at the border for screening people as they move through the border. And this was research being done for use by the United States, but of course has global context and global application. And I think thinking back on that time, it felt like we had so much time and that it was so hypothetical. And I think what really strikes me is the way that we're seeing these technologies applied now, and thinking back on just how, to get overly academic, but like empire acts as empire. And we really see how these technologies are playing out today. But to bring us back to a fond memory of CLTS and really the way it launched our futures. From that reading group, some of us submitted our papers to what became the first We Robot conference and had them accepted, and so traveled to Miami and presented those papers. Some of them were later published in the book Robot Law. There's a 2nd volume of it out now. So really just like when I think of how I got into academia and the work that I do today, a lot of it really started with some of those special opportunities that we had. And I'm really grateful to see some of those collaborators in the room today too.
It was a very cool group of people. You have to expect this, right? Meeting every week to talk about exciting issues related to robots and the law. And one of the issues that I remember, so Kristen and I were both 1L RAs for Ian, techno-ship students, as I think you probably still call it. And one of the first things that we researched for him was the X-ray scanners at the airport, right? The body scanners. They were just being brought in. The privacy commissioner and CATSA were considering whether they were an appropriate use as a primary screening mechanism or whether they needed to be considered only as a secondary mechanism. And on my way here yesterday at the airport, I got directed into the line that goes right through the scanner, not as a secondary test. And so in a small moment of defiance, hearkening back to what I was thinking about in 2009, I said, no, I would like to be manually searched. Just in honor of that research that we did in 2009. I thought it was fitting on my way to this event. Alex, you came the next year. How were your experiences? How do you reflect upon them?
They were great. Yeah, so trusting my memory less. And I should say first off that it's just so exciting to be in a room full of people that have mentored me and that whose work I admire so much. Many of you I know, many of you I don't, but I will be trying to find you and tell you this in person, and friends today. So thank you so much, Florian, and for being on such an amazing panel. But yeah, so I trusted my memory less. So I went to dig for the first assignment I submitted as a 1L Techno RA for Ian Kerr briefly, and he was writing an op-ed on Watson, the IBM computer, playing Ken Jennings in Jeopardy. And so I went to go look at what I would have produced for him, and he was very gracious in his email response back to me. And in the quotes I pulled, the things that really stuck out to me were someone said to Ken Jennings on Twitter, have fun. You looked a little grim last night. And his response was, I am. It's like, the one thing, actually, the person said, having fun is the one thing you can do that Watson can't. And that really stuck with me. And based on what I'm seeing now online and based on the headline of the text in the article my brother sent me this morning, the question of what is left for humans and what isn't, I think has in the last 15 years changed very quickly. And so that's something that really stuck with me is the conversations I had about what is for humans and what is law for. And then I'd be remiss to say that the other thing that was super impactful to me in law school was being part of the Oxford Intellectual Property Moot, which I was coached by Jeremy De Beer, who is, I think, a moot champion, was granted the title of recently, as well as Katie, a co-coach, and one of my teammates, Abby, is in the room, who will be on stage later, and I know a lot of other people here have been involved over the years. And it was so impactful that our moot problem was on trademark law, and I ended up doing a doctorate degree in trademark law and still spend a lot of time thinking about symbols and meaning in the marketplace, especially in increasingly, AI tech-driven media ecosystem. So, yeah, huge impact.
The mooting program under Jeremy's leadership and other people over the years has really given a lot of students through CLTS the opportunity to think about trademark, about copyright, about privacy, about patent in practical, applicable ways. It's been really cool. Alex and her cohort wrote an accidental poem into their factum and made me a t-shirt with the accidental poem emblazoned on it. I still have it. I'll tell you what it is later. It's really great. Susie, tell us about your experience.
Is this working? Yeah. God, I just feel like I had a million stories to think about being in this program. I stuck around it and have been in it, I think, for about 10 years because I'm taking forever to do my PhD and just don't want to leave. But I remember going to law school. My plan was to be like a rural family law lawyer back in the Northern Territories where I'm from. And I came into law school and took the cyber feminism course with Jane in 2012 and just bit by bit slowly started getting derailed from my plans. And that course was so interesting. It was in 2012. So any of you who are familiar with intimate image distribution, those were the years of Rtea Parsons and Amanda Todd and the very early days where there wasn't a lot of law in place, right? And we started to see these really specific gender-based harms that were coming through. And Jane's class was just such a great place to start having that conversation and thinking about it. And it was just a really exciting place to be in. And then throughout the years that I was at U Ottawa, I spent a ton of time traveling with Michael for a cybersecurity class, Ian to Puerto Rico, and just had these extraordinary experiences that weren't just enriching intellectually, but really built community. And I think that's one thing I've always loved about this program and always loved about this institution is that it really is a connector. When I come back to these places, I'm not only learning about these wonderful, innovative things, but also really connecting back to people that I love to spend time with. And it just makes it it kind of made it easy to stick with it. I spent my master's at SIPC. They had an extra office there that I just took over. And every day there was people coming through and having these extraordinary conversations about the evolution of the law. And I think for those of us that started in this time, in the last 10 or 20 years, you really were watching it come up. And because we got interested early, I think we also got these really early opportunities in our career. Like I think of Kristen, who was like, you were like one day into your PhD by the time you got a professorship, and it was just extraordinary. And then thinking now, being a professor at Dalhousie, where I get to specifically teach on these issues and think about these issues, particularly around tech facilitated violence. And there are laws and institutions in place. And now rather than thinking about what can we do, we're thinking about, how can we improve what it is that's available for people. And just speaking with people, particularly, victims who are starting to benefit from some of the changes of law that were things that were only a dream in these early Cyberfeminism Day courses in 2012. It's just extraordinary. And I just feel so lucky to have been able to work with all of these people and on all of these ideas. And, hopefully we'll be back here in 25 years still talking. Yeah.
I like, Susie, where you finished on values, right? Thinking about what kind of values are we prioritizing and emphasizing in the research that we do. And if we kind of think back in time to what the issues were when we were here, when we were experiencing them, perhaps academically, turning them over in our minds for the first time, versus today, when some of these issues have become much more mainstream, how are we starting to conceptualize that transition? Alana, let's go back to you.
So when I started here, I thought the world worked around human rights 24/7. I was lucky to move to Asia shortly after that, and I've spent most of my career pretty much working everywhere but Canada. And my world changed in the last 15 years. I've been some of the people developing the capabilities the governments use and industry uses. And part of that journey really has been a lot of focus on taking down organized criminal syndicates. So I've been doing that for about 15 years. So before I championed human rights, and I still do, but now for me the focus is really quite different. It is about serving my communities in a way that's balanced. So I try to develop with my team systems and platforms that have values at heart and translate that to computer scientists so that they understand that the machines that they're developing have cause and effect to communities and people afterwards. So the law comes into what I do every day, but not in a direct legal way, if that makes any sense. And so there is no right answer to half of these questions. I mean, it's super complex. I've worked on things where at the end of the day, I don't sleep well because you're developing a capability for government, but you actually have no idea what it's going to be used for. You only work on like a small segment of the tech, and you actually don't know how it's going to be deployed afterwards. And so sometimes I think maybe I've done some work that possibly you're all writing about that's really naughty because you actually don't know when you're developing the tech what it's used for. And I think a lot of people don't understand that sort of loophole in there. There's just so many issues in this space that it would take years almost to get to where we are now. And at the moment I'm doing AI, and it's possibly the craziest thing I've ever done in my life. Just, to be honest with you, it's replacing humans. So the work that I do is actually replacing lawyers, so I'm really sorry. But that's kind of like, you can't ignore that. That's happening. Agentic AI is going to do a lot of the stuff that we do, and it's going to augment us to do it better. But if you sit back and ignore those problems, you're probably not going to be employed in 5 to 10 years' time.
Apparently I'm bad at the microphones. That's a deep question, Katie. I think part of the issue goes back to the idea that's been around for a long time, that technology itself is not neutral. And so part of, I think, of what we do in our areas of academia, being technology lawyers, or in civil society, is to look at the new technologies and try and uncover what might seem neutral at first, but often there's embodied values in it, and they're often dual use. So as an example, one project I was involved in with for a while was a large synthetic biology project. And the purpose of the project was to figure out which genes produced certain kind of plant metabolites. So a lot of our economy is actually based on flavors and fragrances and other properties from secondary plant metabolites. And this project, I didn't do this part. This is a bunch of very accomplished biologists who determined what the active genes were that produce these metabolites, and then engineered yeast to produce these genes or to produce the metabolites. And one would think, okay, there's lots of great benefits here for producing new kinds of useful metabolites in ways that are more efficient and cheaper than, say, chopping down a bunch of trees or producing new drugs in a more efficient way. But on the other hand, the technology that was developing in the area also allowed people to synthesize new kinds of DNA, for example, being able to recreate the Spanish flu. So a lot of technology is really dual use. And I think part of what we are trying to do is uncover what the different values are at stake. And then we have to figure out what are the values. It raises the question, what are the values that we should be engineering into the technology, and how do we do that? So I think that's part of the answer.
I mean, it's a hard question. When I think about that question, I think about what Bruno Latour says about technology is society made durable, which I think is an interesting way of putting it. Kristen, I know you've thought a lot about these questions in critical lenses. Tell us what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's a hard question that I think I grapple with a lot and like try to self-reflect on, is like, what values do we bring into the research that we do? I try to think of myself as engaging in broad understanding of feminist research, which to me has come to mean trying to understand different oppressive systems and how they operate within and through and concealed by technology. And so to me, that like in current research, that really involves looking at the connections that might feel otherwise invisible because of the use of technology. So things like drawing together connection or an understanding, and I'm not saying I do this perfectly by any means, but between things like violent labor practices in the global south in the context of resource extraction that facilitates the growth of the industry, with threats to, Canada's sovereignty and turning Canada into the 51st state, and understanding the systems that operate through that. Or something as seemingly innocuous as a home surveillance camera that might film and record what happens in the street in front of you, but then feeds into a larger surveillance network if connected to, say corporate like companies behind these cameras that can amass all that data together, and then drawing the connection of that with predictive algorithms that are used to justify military targets like Lavender and Gossipal, which have been used to justify different targets in Gaza. And then trying to understand the border AI context that I was talking about, thinking about where these technologies are developed, what they're developed for, and the way that they're being used in whatever we want to call what ICE is doing in the United States right now, and what that means for us here in Canada also, and that some of those tools are actually built right here in Ottawa and sold to ICE agencies, or to the ICE agency. And what does it then mean when we can start to maybe see and visualize some of these connections? And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that there's so many ways that that the AI robotics industry can conceal on purpose these connections so that we don't see the politics in what we're doing, to go back to what Greg was saying. And that I think as academics, we're so privileged to have the time and opportunity to dig into this in ways that people in other industries and areas can't necessarily take that time. And so to me, that's maybe one of the biggest contributions that I hope to make, is just spending that time really reflecting on these values.
Yeah, as we see AI being deployed more and more, it's hard not to understand it as having some inherent politics, right? One of our other framing ideas from science and technology studies being that artifacts have politics. Big part of our education, I think, through thinking through technology policy questions through this lens. But we were very emphatic that we didn't want this panel to be only about AI. So we also turned to related areas of technology policy. And I know, Alex, you've spent a lot of time thinking about the ways to approach these issues.
Yes, but then I thought about AI the whole way up here on the train. I think one of the values that drew me to law school was what I now think was an erroneous, magical thinking that law ordered our world, and that by learning law, I was going to get a great handle on what was going on around me and how we made sense of things, which I think is part of the puzzle, but maybe not the magic, keystone I was hoping it was when I got here. And so I think one of the values that I still see coming up today that's definitely driven my research and my curiosity is how humans do make meaning of the world around them, and the role that technology plays in helping us shape that and doing that and limiting and obscuring meaning all around us. And so I'm particularly interested now in online so I don't know if anyone still gets paper newspapers. I get one. I'm really proud of that. So but you get your information online. It's filtered by algorithms. A lot of it's AI created now. People don't often know that. And so I'm really curious about what's going to happen to the way we intake information around us and how we're going to start to understand the world around us, especially in such a politically divisive time where we have so much demagoguery and inability to speak to one another. How is that going to get compounded by the ways that we interpret and intake this information? And really the role of humility in that, and questioning why we believe what we believe and where that comes from in ourselves. And I feel really privileged to be a law professor now and get to talk to my students about that on a basis that they probably are finding irritating at this point. But really trying to bring in this view of like an epistemological reflexivity of like, why in law do we think what we think? Why are these things true? And how is that something that we can use technology to help us navigate or that will limit us? And so those are the kinds of questions that are driving me now.
I mean, it's an academic panel when someone uses the phrase epistemological reflexivity. Like, this is serious business. Susie, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that the thing that I think a lot about is interdisciplinarity and like all the different ways that we need to come at this from, I think is the thing that often circles through my mind. And I think, again, through the opportunities through this program, there's been all sorts of ways that we can think of how to intervene, both law and non-law, which I think is great. And Jane's always taught me that lesson. That's always been a big one, being like, there's law, but like, is law always that helpful? Like, what else can we think about? And so like during the last 10 years or so that I've been working on this, connecting with folks like Rhiannon Wong, who does a lot of work with the BC Society of Transition Houses, and thinking about how can we advocate for solutions that people actually need. So I find in the last couple of years, sometimes I've wondered whether I'm actually a sociologist or a lawyer, because I've been talking a lot to people about like, what are the remedies that you actually want, and thinking about the values of that in the work that we're doing, not just how can we change the law, but how can we change the law in ways that are most effective to actually bring out equality in the world, particularly in digital spaces. And some of that is through the law. Like when I was working with SIPC, we did an intervention on a voyeurism case, that came out with really good factors to think about the different ways we think about the reasonable expectation of privacy. That's not just this kind of inside-outside thing. And I think that changed the law in a really positive way. And so you can kind of pick away at the law a little bit in these ways, or working a lot with provinces and governments that are looking to change intimate image laws. Do we include deepfakes? Do we not include deepfakes, right? There's those spaces there. But then a lot of the work is actually just going and talking to organizations that are the frontline spaces where people actually go to get help. And in the research that I do, what we find is even when people are experiencing significant harms, law is not the first place they go. And law is not always the most helpful place they go, especially when we're thinking about victims of sexual violence. Like, our legal system has not had a great track record of creating safe spaces and creating the remedies and solutions. So I think a lot of the values that I try and embed in the work that I do is trying to avoid that just law is the answer piece, and actually talking to humans and saying, like, what's working? How can we do more of that? And some of it is experimental, and some of it you try something out, it doesn't work. In BC, they've got this great new civil resolution tribunal where you can, get a faster track response if your images have been distributed without consent. And, and that seems like a really great model, but we'll probably have to wait 5 years to see, is it effective? Are people using it? And I think being open and curious, but ultimately being focused on the actual people who are having the experiences that we're talking about and thinking about, and focusing as much as we can on them.
Love that. There's a couple of themes that we see emerging, right? There's a conversation around privacy, autonomy, consent, individual rights, individual values, and how those have transitioned over time as new technologies come into the conversation. And then added to that, when you think about the competencies of the center, right, of law, technology, and society, how do we have people from different silos coming together to have those kinds of conversations together about how to make a better future, right? What types of expertise do you need to bring in to academic discourse in order to have transdisciplinary translation, right? In order to talk to one another, bring the right people to the table, and hopefully do something that is going to make the world a slightly better place. Hopefully, Hannah. We don't know for sure. So I think everyone is working on exciting projects, whether it be in their research or their teaching. And perhaps the next thing that I'll throw to our panelists is there something you want to share about what you're working on right now? Or whether it be your interactions with your students, a big research project that you're really excited about and that has been informed by the trajectory that we've discussed so far.
So I view my role as a professor as serving my communities. I could care less if I ever published again. I do lots of research for defense. I publish papers, but really it's a privilege to serve your communities. So some of the projects that I'm most proud about have nothing to do with computers. They're going into domestic violence shelters, and we run digital forensics on phones because a lot of people in vulnerable situations have all sorts of crazy things on their phones that spouses put on them, and they don't know they're there. So we bring students in and we run forensics on the phone, and we remove spyware and things that they didn't even know were on their phone. We do those kind of education campaigns. I've started the world's first free cybersecurity center, so it operates like a legal aid center, only you can bring your tech in to learn about your tech. And we do a lot of work with startups with getting the security and the privacy right from the ground go, from the design of the tech, working with the law. But recently, Google's been funding a lot of our work to work with CALD communities, so cultural and linguistically diverse communities. So we've got a bunch of funding now where we're delivering cybersecurity and safety training for women in refugee camps around the world at the moment. So that's, that makes me feel good and a little bit better about the surveillance stuff maybe that I've developed in the past. And some of that sounds like it's just training, but there's actually a lot of agentic AI models that are going into even some of the things we're developing for how we can automate some of this, because you can't just go in and constantly do forensics. You've got to produce some sort of a product that scales, if that makes sense, to help humanity. It can't always be a one-to-one effort. So that's what makes me excited in the morning.
Cybersecurity seems to be all the rage these days. So I'm at the beginning phase of a research project. We just got a pretty good-sized research grant on cybersecurity. I know there's people in this room, such as Elizabeth, who've worked on cybersecurity in the election context. Our project is called Protecting Democracy from Cyber Threats. It's a 3-year project. We're probably in behind 6 months. So now it's about 2.5-year project. Part of it does involve looking at the role of artificial intelligence in creating synthetic media in online and social media, and its impacts on individuals and how it might be part of influence campaigns in elections and ultimately focusing democracy. So whereas in early days, I think early in this program, we thought a lot about electronic commerce and the digital means necessary for doing electronic commerce in terms of, and even partly in terms of cybersecurity, the use of authentication and electronic signatures, security and privacy issues. Now, everything, including to some extent, elections are becoming digitized. Albeit, of course, we still have the paper ballot. Fortunately for federal elections, there's much more digitization of voter information, of information that people use to rely on to make decisions, and a lot of misinformation and disinformation that's out there, and influence campaigns, domestic and foreign. And so now we're into a kind of digital democracy issue, and issues of digital sovereignty have been in the news lately. And so part of our research project is to look at that. And one idea that we're working on actually is producing educational video games, perhaps like a game where we have a bunch of different variables and roles in a democracy in different democratic institutions, and people can sort of play with the dials and experiment in this game in terms of how it might, what decisions might proceed, to end up with a fascist state or something like that, and how to avoid it, and how not to be misled or misguided by some of the techniques, the pretty advanced techniques in terms of propaganda that are being used. If you read some of Jason Stanley's work, for example. So that's one. I don't have much to report there, but we're at the very beginning of a research project on that.
I'll mention, I think I sort of preemptively jumped into this question in the last question a little, but I'll mention one project that's a bit of a tangent, because I still remember a long time ago, I think it was early in my PhD, Ian Kerr gave me this really valuable advice that, like, who you are as a person is who you show up as a professor, as a researcher, et cetera. And so I'm working on a project right now that's in collaboration with pediatricians, and we're looking at whether there are ways in which image generating software, Gen AI, to use the fancy term, could be used to help preserve children's privacy in the context of producing medical images. And that stems from my own family's experience with pediatric oncology and my child's involvement in some of these images. And so I think just drawing in that personal experience to the work that you hope will be beneficial to others down the road is something that's been really meaningful to me.
And it's a great lesson, right? The personal is political, and it informs all the things that we do as academics. And being ourselves is so important. Of course, Ian always told me that for he and I, this was really just a vehicle for comedy. So I'm trying to show up that way today, as you might be able to tell. Alex?
Yeah, so kind of to pick up on both those comments, and you're asking what we're excited about. Now, I think I'm really trying to understand for myself why people hear what they hear when something is said, which I think really goes to the importance of dealing with problematic information online and propaganda. And so, a lot of my own personal experiences. And so I'm really trying to understand, when people are in conflicts with one another, what's happening for them. And so that's taking me into some really fun reading about conflicts and mediation, which I was remembering from classes back in first year. And so, what happens to humans as a body when we're in conflict, and trying to make sense of that for myself, and how that will then fit back into law.
There's two things that I've really been enjoying doing lately. The first project is just talking with teenagers. I think everyone should just talk to teenagers. They're so wonderful. I've been talking to them about their experiences with sexuality in digital spaces, both positive and negative. And some of it's hard, right? I also think talking to young people, the internet, it can be a very, very unsafe place for some young people, but they're also so wildly innovative. I was talking to this young trans person who lives in a small rural community. Their primary social group is on the internet, and thank God for the internet for that. And this person figured out a way to code, I forget whether it was Reddit or Discord, but they had somehow figured out themselves to go through anyone who wanted to follow them. They were an artist. They had like 10,000 followers. And And they had a way that whenever anyone went to follow them, that it would either be like green, yellow, or red. And somehow they'd program something to see whether people had engaged with negative commentary about trans people or positive commentary or nothing at all. And it like signaled to them right away. And this was something that they just created for themselves for safety. And it was just hearing this story also shows that like the companies have a long way to go. Like that would be a great service if you could just click that button and have that show up for you. But just really inspired with use. Also the innovative ways that they find ways to get around all of the controls that we try to give for them, any parental controls, anything else. They're very innovative on how to maintain their internets. So I've been loving having those conversations and talking to them from a really youth-based, rights-based perspective too, like what information should they have access to, like what are the benefits and the positivity on the internet. So that work has been really meaningful and kind of working it into material that'll be accessible to young people in language that's accessible to them. So feeling really good about that project. And then I found in the last 2 years specifically, a lot more judges, a lot more police officers, a lot more social service organizations have been reaching out and just wanting to learn a lot more about tech-facilitated violence and, intimate partner violence and thinking about the way that technology comes in with it. So I've been able to have some really great conversations, even with things like bail judges. So bail judges, often when you're thinking about intimate partner violence, most of the requirements that you have when someone goes on bail, it's like stay 50 meters away from someone, don't be in physical contact with them. But there's all these new risks, right, with technology and intimate partner violence. And so even just we didn't come up with any solutions, but just thinking about what are the types of orders that might need to be put in place to protect someone from technological harms. Do you have shared accounts? Do you need to make orders to say you can't be on the shared calendar? You can't be following my Strava account anymore. You can't be able to, put an Apple AirTag on my car. Like, is following someone's location something that's a violation of current bail orders, right? And so I've just found that there's been a really open space recently where people want to at least talk about it a lot more. And so just being invited into those spaces and having an opportunity to have those conversations, to start thinking about the ways that we can help people who've been impacted by different forms of gender-based violence and the way that technology impacts it gives me a lot of hope and also makes us all very busy, which is the other thing about this type of work. It's I think we're all getting a lot of phone calls right now to help educate people. So just appreciate that space and openness that's showing up.
Yeah, listening to you talk about that, I'm reminded when you and I were at the National Judicial Institute with the family law judges last year. Family law judges, very interesting lens on technology, right? What kind of technological issues are coming to the fore in a divorce proceeding? And they tell us every time someone gets divorced now, guess what's in the record? Reams and reams of text messages, right? So thinking about that informational privacy, about the devices, about that window into your life that's being introduced. Perhaps I'll share one interesting project that I'm working on with Marina Pavlovich that I'm really excited about. And we're working on thinking about contract law in the age of generative AI. So if we're thinking through the lens of a standard form contract, right? Massively distributed boilerplate. What does that look like in terms of the ethical obligations that a lawyer has to their client, to upholding the administration of justice and the rule of law, which we think is a lens that hasn't really been conducted in contract law before, and in particular, how do those rights get changed and get supercharged in an era when people are going to be able to use generative AI to produce those boilerplates, right? Does that change the impact of a contract if, like, we're already moving out of that realm of click wrap contracts, of clicking I agree, right? Your shrink wrap contracts of the 1990s, where as soon as you ripped the cellophane on the software, you were deemed to have accepted the terms of the contract. Is there something more nefarious about a contract in an era when generative AI is drafting the terms? Or is that just the same as having a repository of contracts that your firm holds, right, that you're going to rely upon? And so one of the things that we're interested in doing is empirical work in terms of how AI is being used in different law firms around the country. And we're starting to pilot that project now. So very excited about that. All right, so I think at this point, I'd like to throw it open to the audience because I could ask questions of our panelists all day, but we'd love to hear from you. What are you interested in? What would you love to hear about academia? Do you have any interesting questions that have come up based on the experiences that our panelists have shared today? Kelly? I think you have to go to one of these mics that have been set up in the room. Yeah.
First of all, thank you, everyone. I was on school drop-off, that's why I came in late. I'm sorry. My question is for Susie, I guess. I'm a sociologist who finds myself in legal conversations. So I say to my colleagues in sociology, my happiest home is actually CLTS at the University of Ottawa. I think it's quite offensive to them. But I find that, as someone who studies social justice vis-a-vis tech, I'm pulled into kind of governance conversations and then the law. But I obviously have limits on my expertise when it comes to the law, so I often partner with legal colleagues, many of whom are in this room. My question is, you mentioned that you have sociological leanings. Do you see, I guess, okay, often when I'm in those legal conversations, I get reduced to an ethicist. I get called an ethicist. So, there's the lawyers, and they're often dealing with like human rights dimensions around tech, and then some of the legal compliance issues. And then I get sort of put in the ethics bucket. But I work with a colleague here who is an ethicist, Jason Miller, and I think that's a distinct kind of expertise from sociology, someone who's concerned about the reproduction of systemic racism, for example, via tech. And I think the legal expertise is different. So my question is this. Florian said not to go on and on. I hear the need for interdisciplinary narrative, and I'm part of that. I buy into that. But do you see that there are potentially distinct areas of expertise, I guess is my question. And then how have you maybe worked with colleagues with other kinds of expertise, be it ethics, maybe in the Omics project, or sociology, and then law, and how do you bring them together, I guess, meaningfully? Are there limits to the extent you can call yourself a sociologist?
Yeah, I am not a sociologist.
I'm just being
but adjacent. Yeah. So I found working with teams has been really important. And I've been invited onto projects where they wanted to be a sole author. They wanted me to be a sole author on something where like a quantitative study has been done. But they want me to, kind of do some of the analysis on the data and then, kind of add the context and the legal context to it. And in those situations, I've often had to say, like, no, I can't be. Like, I am not a quant person. I am not a qual person. I have some basic understanding of all of these things, but I really need a teammate for that. And I think I've been really lucky in the last few years to be on a SHIRT grant with some sociologists, and I find that combination is actually something that's been really strong for grant writing. Like, we have just been knocking it out of the park with grants these days, because the sociologists are saying, wanting to look into this research, but when you add that policy and law element to it, there's something that's really appealing for it. And for us, it's like a long-term strategic goal, some of these projects, because you need the sociologists to be able to bring in that quantitative and qualitative data. There's a lot of legal arguments that I've tried to make when I'm going into government, but they say, like, where's the numbers, where's the data, where's the story, and particularly in Canada. And this is, and actually in other countries. So I worked on a project with CG where we did a quant study on tech-facilitated violence, because most of the data is coming out of Australia, it's coming out of the UK, it's coming out of the US, but we weren't seeing a lot happening, particularly in the majority world. So we started collecting data from the majority world, so we could say, okay, like, if you're in this particular country, what does this harm actually look like? Because it looks different. And so I found the benefit of working with sociologists is we can think of what the legal question is. Like, what is the legal issue that's coming up, that's coming forward? So I look at intimate images and youth online harms, and what's the data that would be helpful to help tell the stories that we need to tell. And so finding people who are committed to the same issues as you are is, I think, the first thing, like finding that partnership. for people who are committed to that work, and then actually creating the data that you can then use to make the legal and policy arguments. I actually find that flow from an academic perspective is something that's incredibly important. And sometimes in law, we don't have that opportunity to find those partnerships. So I think when I think of my long-term goals, like that's something that I want to keep doing, is finding people who can help find those answers for us. And sometimes the answers are not the answers that we expected. Like we have, and that's a beautiful thing about research. But I do think in some ways we need to stay in our lanes. Like I try and stay in my legal lane as much as possible and partner with my sociological folks who can then put it together. But it is an interesting dance, right? When we get asked to speak, like sometimes, we'll be asked to just speak in front of a government body about a particular law that's coming up, and they'll ask one of our non-legal folks to come in, and we always have to do that dance, be like, is it appropriate in this particular moment to send one of our SOS folks rather than one of our law folks? And then sometimes I'll be out speaking about the data, but if anybody's actually going to, ask me really intense methodological questions, like I can't answer those ones. But I think especially in law and tech right now, where we really do have a lack of information, on all of this AI, all of these things, we need people who are doing that base groundwork data collection in order to be successful, and in order to, like most of us, I think, stand by evidence-based research. And I think in law and tech right now, we are kind of running and moving forward on laws where we actually don't have evidence on this legal approach actually going to be effective in these ways, and it ends up being a cycle where then you create the law, you study the law, and you circle back.
I mean, if you're saying quant and qual just so casually, you really do sound very authoritative, I think. Let's have another question.
Hi, my name is Kim McPhail, and I'm actually an economist who studied here just one floor up or one floor down when the economics department was still in this building. So my question is that I heard from almost every panelist about various specific projects that could do some good. But I have to say that in almost every case, what came to my mind is how, I think as you said, that specific project could be just recycled to do an awful lot of harm. And so what I find in Canada is that we're always very late on identifying the laws that are allowed, that place some boundaries on these things. So is that correct? And if it is correct, are there other countries who have succeeded in doing this while maintaining a democratic and rule of law approach, and how to go about this? Because there's such pressure that whoever gets there first is the winner, and if you don't get there first, that's it. So how do we do that, if it's possible, without a race to the gutter? Thank you.
So an easy question. How do we regulate any of this? I mean, I don't know. In the literature, right, they'll call this the Calling Ridge dilemma or the pacing problem. This idea that technological innovation is always out of step with legal regulation or statutory change. My favorite way I've ever heard it described is the avocado ripeness problem. Not yet, not yet, not yet, not yet, not yet. Too late, right? Anyone who's ever tried to ripen an avocado on their counter knows what I'm talking about. Is anyone really keen to jump in on this one? Alex?
Yeah, and I want to, just for all the open air community members in the room, because I think one of the things that has frustrated me over time is the reactive nature of law sometimes, and not always, but often. And one of the research methods that I was fortunate to learn as a law student on Jeremy DeBeer's project is scenarios and foresighting. So how to start thinking about things in much longer timelines, and we mean like 50 years out, 25 years out, and then backcasting backwards to what's happening and what's needed. And I think I remember learning as a law student being like, well, I can't use your imagination, which I had more of back then, but you get stuck, right? So I think it's actually really helpful to know that there are these like methods out there that can help us think past the muck that we're in and jump out to somewhere where you're not constrained by the types of things you are today, and then look back. And so I think futures thinking and scenarios thinking is a super useful approach in the law and technology space, especially.
if I can layer into that, because I think that's super helpful. And I teach tort law, which is like suing people for causing harm, basically, for any non-lawyers in the room. But also a lot of the major class actions right now against various AI companies whose tools have caused very serious harm are being brought through tort law, through negligence, through product liability, which, I mean, we'll see how that materializes. And actually, to Alex, also through intellectual property laws and claims around copyright violations. But I think that I completely agree that, like, thinking ahead, but then also thinking imaginatively about what we have right now, like some very old laws that, anyway, have a long funny history that you would never imagine would be applied to AI systems that cause very serious harm, are also still useful and applicable.
I have the privilege of traveling a lot in Switzerland and Singapore. They're already thinking 70 years ahead, and they have been for a long time. So back in 2005, Switzerland was preparing for no one to work in their economy. And they were preparing it from a legal position, an economic position, and a behavioral societal position in terms of how do you keep people occupied if they no longer have value to find in their work. So these conversations are happening in other parts of the world at a much more prolific rate. I don't hear sovereign AI spoken about too much here, but there's a race for sovereign AI in other countries. Right, that sovereign AI that sits before the generative AI, because those countries have realized they cannot be using Chinese and American products if they're going to maintain sovereignty in terms of their culture, their way of life, the values that they hold, their economies, etc. So these are conversations being had. I just don't know if they're being had everywhere.
Let's hear from our next question asker.
So my name is Ricardo. I was part of the LLM some years ago. I just have a question following what you were saying regarding the pace of how technology is changing, how regulation is changing. So for me, it's like how academy is changing for you. Like, have you seen like methodology change, your daily work, your practical job just changing by the use of AI? Like, how does it work for you in academy?
This is a great question. Who wants to go first? Susie?
Yeah, I think so. One thing that's a total struggle is from an academic disciplinary perspective, we have no idea what we're doing with AI. Like, it's just such a mess. At Dalhousie, we're still figuring it out. The rule right now is that all profs just make up their own rule about what they want for AI. So some folks have it in their syllabus that if you use any AI, you are cheating, you are booted. I have it in mind that it's like, well, I think you should play with it, but, don't use it to, do your analysis or do all your writing. But I think it's important to kind of check it out and do a little bit. So I think there's a lot of confusion. And I think one of the challenges with the confusion that comes with that is that students are freaked out to tell us how they're using it, because they're worried about being told that they're going to be cheating if they're using it. And then they're facing this kind of contradictory message that, like, some of it might be cheating, but at the same time, all the LexisNexis are like pumping out their AI saying you should be using it. And a lot of law firms now, more and more law firms that I've been talking to are using it. I was chatting with a lawyer who uses Harvey AI and was thinking next year that they're probably going to hire like one less assistant, one less articling student, just because they found that one has been very helpful for reducing the level of their work. And so I think there's challenges from an academic perspective to figure out how it's being used, why it's being used, and is it actually helping students learn, think, talk, write, or is it supplementing those skills for them so that they're leaving their education with no skills, which we hope not to have happen. And then at Dalhousie, we're going to create a class that's going to be taught by Professor Rossborough that's cross-appointed between computer science and law, that's going to talk about what technologies are law firms using, what are the risks, what are our professional obligations as we're using them. I think everybody's got to learn how to read a terms of service of any program that you're using, like knowing where your data is going. So I think from an academic perspective, we're just right in that muddy time of, like, who knows? So yeah, but it is changing things. And then I also think from a teaching perspective, trying to figure out what to teach in a generalized law and technology course is almost impossible, because we need like 45 classes and we only get 10. Yeah.
I'm getting the wrap up sign, so very quick.
I got one last thought that I would add to that, which I think that as teachers, whether us as academic teachers or teachers within law firms or industry, et cetera, it's really to start thinking more about how do we teach tech critical skills, not exclusively tech criticism, but how do we teach people to be more critical of what's happening behind the system that they're adopting into their education, into their law firm, into wherever it might be. And I think that's something that CLTS has been so amazing about doing for 25 plus years, which is like truly incredible. I tell everybody, oh, I got my JD and PhD at U Ottawa because it lends so much weight to that tech critical ability.
Well, that's probably a great place to finish, Kristen, landing the plane on what a fabulous place this is, how proud we all are to have done our academic work here, and how we take that with us in our careers going forward. So thank you all very much for your attention, and I believe it is now break.